Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever presidential candidate forum on entrepreneurship. We are so glad to have you here with us today. We are here live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with a room full of Iowans and entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial supporters from across the region. Mayor, great to have you here as well. My name is Victor Hwang. I'm the founder and CEO of Right to Start. I'm an entrepreneur myself. I've been involved in working with entrepreneurs over several decades of my life. Right to Start is an organization, we are a national nonprofit organization that is nonpartisan, and we work to lift entrepreneurship up as a civic issue across the entire country. And the idea is that we believe that entrepreneurship and access to entrepreneurial opportunity is a basic human right. It's something that every person should have access to. We believe deep in our hearts that everyone is born to be a starter, a maker, a doer, and a dreamer, and we should have a system that responds to that. Now, entrepreneurship has typically not been part of the national debate, but that's what our goal is here today, is to actually lift up this issue, to get it into the discourse and have people talking about it. We engage with policymakers and civic leaders across the country to talk about this issue. So when we thought about, should we do a forum and why do we want to do it, that was really the impetus, was to think about how do we actually bring in policymakers who care about this issue and get these issues up on the table so we can talk about them and figure out how can we help the entrepreneurs, people that want to start and grow their own businesses. One particular aspect of this issue with entrepreneurship is it's typically viewed as kind of like a side issue. And we believe entrepreneurship is something that touches almost every aspect of our lives. It's not just entrepreneurship as a little tiny thing on the side. It actually touches issues of human opportunity and aspiration, but also issues of healthcare, education, workforce, childcare, government contracting, economic development, workforce training, and many other aspects of policy making that usually aren't talked about. So we're going to cover a lot of these types of issues today. And before I get into that, though, I want to talk about why entrepreneurship is so important. Why are we here talking about this issue? Well, entrepreneurship is something that is actually a huge driver in our prosperity. And so only 18% of Americans realize this, but entrepreneurship, new business growth, is responsible for almost all net job creation in the economy. So when we talk about where do jobs come from, we should really be talking about how do we spur and support those people trying to build new businesses. That's not something that happens very often. We also know it's an issue that helps overcome political division, and we've seen this work at Right to Start, where we've been involved in working with policymakers across party lines trying to build entrepreneurial activity and support. And these issues, we find, actually generate a lot of support from many different walks of life. We actually took a poll at Right to Start last fall. And we found that this issue has broad bipartisan support. America, at its very heart, has entrepreneurship in its DNA. We are, in fact, a nation of silent strivers. We found that 94% of Americans actually believe that it's important to the future of this country that everyone have a fair chance to start and grow their own business. 94%, and that cuts across party lines. And 92% of American voters, though, say that it's difficult or very difficult to start a business today. And so there's the sense that the system's not inherently fair. In fact, there was a survey done by the Kauffman Foundation, where I used to be, which found that 81% of entrepreneurs say that government favors big business, and 69% of entrepreneurs say that government doesn't care about them at all. So there's the sense that the playing field is not level, that inherently we should be doing a lot more for our entrepreneurs than we actually are. If we can do entrepreneurship right, and we can actually bring in better support for entrepreneurs, we can help people start and grow their own businesses more successfully, we found, and the data shows, that it actually increases wealth. For every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a county, it increases household wealth by over $400. For every 1% increase in entrepreneurial activity in a state, it correlates with a 2% decrease in poverty in a state. So entrepreneurship is part of income creation, it's part of wealth creation, it's part of poverty alleviation, it's part of job creation. So it's a core part of the American dream and part of our collective prosperity. Right to Start now, we launched 3 years ago, so we just celebrated our 3rd anniversary. So we're still a fairly young organization, but we already have a footprint in 28 states. We have people on the ground at the grassroots doing organizing. We have civic leaders and influencers that are part of our network as ambassadors. And we've been very thrilled with what we've been able to pull off so far. In fact, just a few weeks ago, Governor Joe Lombardo of Nevada signed the first Right to Start Act into law, which is the first ever state to create a comprehensive, broad-based reform for entrepreneurship, including creating an Office of Entrepreneurship in the state of Nevada to coordinate all state policy around supporting people starting and growing their own businesses. So we're at this really interesting inflection point in the American landscape, which is how do we create a system that empowers and enables people to be able to start and build their own businesses. And we're finding it right to start. We're tapping into something that's actually a very deep vein. So why Iowa? Why Cedar Rapids? This is a place that is I used to live here. So when I was young, I actually spent a couple years of my life in the Quad Cities, and I love this place. And so Iowa, of course, is a state that has a very important role in the American debate, given its early stages in the Republican primaries. But Cedar Rapids in particular has a really powerful story. Not a lot of Americans remember this, but in 2008, there was a devastating flood that wiped out the core of the city. And in the rebuilding of Cedar Rapids and the renewal of Cedar Rapids to what it is today, entrepreneurs played a very key role. The entrepreneurs were at the forefront of rebuilding and rejuvenating the city. And I've had the pleasure of coming here multiple times over the past few years and seeing it in action. And it's really a sight to behold. And it's truly inspiring for people to see what's been able to happen in this town. Our partners here, New BOCO, the New Bohemian Innovation Collective, which runs the Iowa Startup Accelerator, have been tremendous partners both in the rejuvenation of Cedar Rapids as a whole, but also in putting this together. So we're very grateful for New BOCO and all the tremendous work they do day in and day out to support the entrepreneurs here in Cedar Rapids. We're also thrilled and grateful for a lot of the organizations across the region that have been supportive of this. We have entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial supporters who've been involved in this work and in the forum from Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, Wisconsin, the surrounding region. And we have people coming all the way from Arkansas, our friends at Heartland Forward, who are here, part of the Heartland renewal efforts in shaping policy and narrative across the entire region. We are very fortunate today to have candidates that actually are deeply involved in entrepreneurship. These are folks with deep relationships to entrepreneurs. They've been entrepreneurs themselves. They've been involved in supporting entrepreneurs. And so it's a special group of candidates we have here. And we're very grateful that they're able to engage in this conversation with us and take time out of their very busy campaign schedules to do so. The format we're going to have is we're going to have 4 interviews. And just shy of 30 minutes, given some of the timing issues, 28 minutes, exactly 28 minutes for each interview. And then we'll follow it with 7 minutes of break. And that 7 minutes of break between each one will allow the media to talk with the candidates, as well as give you chances to network with each other. Networking, we know amongst entrepreneurs, is very important. There's a lot of relationships to be made between people who support entrepreneurs in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And now I would like to welcome my colleague and co-interviewer on stage, Christine Haughney Dare-Bryan. She's a veteran journalist, and she's an editor-at-large at Inc. magazine, who has been our wonderful media partner through this process. She's a former reporter with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. She is also an Emmy-nominated and James Beard Award-winning producer. There's a television series called Rotten on Netflix, all about our food supply chain, which is fantastic, and I encourage you to watch it. She also, as of now, just in the last few weeks, launched a new podcast about the birth of the internet called Computer Freaks, which is the #1 history podcast right now. And on Tuesday, she has a brand new Netflix series called Poisoned about food safety in America. Very honored to have Christine with me. Welcome, Christine. And let me lay out some ground rules right as we get started here. One, we want this work to be an antidote to some of the polarization that's out there in our discourse. Entrepreneurship is something that is uniting, and it's constructive. And so we want there to be a respectful, civil, constructive discussion. Applause is okay. We encourage you to applaud for things that you like. But we ask that there's no protest or outbursts or unconstructive behavior during this event. I know we're in Iowa, and so Iowa nice is sort of the rule of the day. Okay? Well, thank you very much. And I am pleased now to introduce Mayor Francis Suarez. Mayor Suarez is the mayor of Miami, Florida since 2017. He is one of America's most outspoken mayors and national leaders in advancing entrepreneurship at the city level. He's been promoting entrepreneurship through initiatives such as Venture Miami, which offers concierge-level support to entrepreneurs. He's created and launched eStart, which was a digital program to streamline and digitize the process of permits to start a business in Miami. He was a practicing lawyer and previously served on the Miami City Commission from 2009 to 2017. He's a graduate of Florida International University and received his JD from the University of Florida. Please welcome Mayor Francis Suarez. Hey, Mayor. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
The hot seat.
It's the hot seat.
Yes, it is the hot seat.
Thank you for joining us, Mayor.
Thanks for having me.
You've been involved in supporting entrepreneurs, and you've become very outspoken about entrepreneurship issues, and you've worked with entrepreneurs of many kinds across Miami your entire life. What have you seen as some of the obstacles that entrepreneurs face, and what are some of the things you would do to help alleviate those as president?
Well, first, I myself have been an entrepreneur and a small business owner. And I think small business is such a large percentage of what makes this country successful. So I think, as you sort of mentioned in your initial monologue, it seems like oftentimes government is working against business and small business, either through excessive regulation, through the time it takes to start a business, the cost that it takes to start a business, and just navigating the process. Sometimes it's just not user-friendly. Right, you'll go on a website just to start a business, and you don't realize how many governments you have to interact with at a variety of different levels. You have to go through a variety of processes that can be expensive. I mean, just in the state of Florida, and Florida is probably a better state than most. You obviously have to get a tax ID number. You go to the federal government. You can do that for free instantly. So the largest government in the world you would think is the most difficult, and oftentimes in the course of starting a business is probably one of the easiest. Then you go to the state of Florida, and you can open up a corporation for about $70, and you get the corporation filed in approximately 24 to 48 hours, so that's not bad. And then you go to the city, and we're trying to streamline the process of where you get a business tax receipt, certificate of use, and all those things, so you can get started as quickly as possible. That's actually the most expensive and sometimes the most time-consuming process, which is sort of counterintuitive. You think in a city or at the local government level, that should be the fastest and the least expensive. And so we've tried to undo that and make it easier for our residents.
And how have you heard voters talk about this as being important to them when they say, oh, thank you for doing this? Or do you find that it's something that doesn't really matter that much?
No, it definitely matters. Mayor O'Donnell can tell you as a mayor, it definitely matters. And it matters sometimes when they're having a hard time getting started and they're frustrated. Particularly when they realize that there are other costs that are associated with starting a business that don't stop just because the government's taking a long time. Like, for example, if you've borrowed money to capitalize, the interior build out of a restaurant or whatever, the sort of borrowing costs don't stop just because, a government is taking too long. You can't go back to the bank and say, hey, can you do me a favor, give me a break on my loan? So that's a part of it. That's real. And I think the other part of it is just a frustration. Most people, I would say the vast majority of people, they want to comply with the law. They want to follow the law. But sometimes the law becomes so expensive, so cumbersome, so difficult that they don't know where to start. They don't know how to navigate it. And oftentimes they just sort of give up. It's not that they don't want to comply, it's that they kind of give up.
And when people talk about what it means when they're giving up on a business or they're frustrated at business as a business person, what does that mean to you, given that you've been involved in entrepreneurship?
It's tough because what happens is, let's say they give up but they stay in business, right? Meaning that they don't cross their T's and dot their I's. That can create a problem because the lack of compliance could create some sort of burden on some neighboring business. And so usually you'll get a call from the neighboring business saying, hey, these people haven't followed the rules, they haven't checked all the boxes, et cetera, and it's hurting me. And then I think the other part is, sometimes they get to a place where they can never start the business or the business fails almost immediately. Restaurants is a great example because they haven't properly been able to factor in the capital costs and the break-even point in a way that gives them enough time to really get a market going. And so, people don't realize how influential government can be in a destructive way, unfortunately, when you're trying to create a small business that works. There's a small margin for error.
Right, and when you talk about capital access too, that barrier of capital access, is that something that you've thought about, and how have you dealt with that barrier?
It is, and I think that's, you talked about Venture Miami, which is an office that I created as mayor, and part of it is not just concierge services for people who are moving here, which it is part of what we do, but I think the other part of it was capital access, particularly for people who were not tapping into it as effectively as they're represented in the general population. We're seeing some major discrepancies with women-founded companies, with minority-founded companies. There was a huge discrepancy, particularly when you consider performance. They were overperforming and being underfunded, so there was an incongruity there that just didn't make sense. So we're trying to bridge that gap, and just generally speaking, you referred to the Kauffman Foundation. We were ranked by the Kauffman Foundation as one of the best startup communities in the country. Yet you have to be able to scale, right, if you want to grow. And so scaling comes in a variety of different ways. You bootstrap, right? You use your own money to sort of layer on top of your growth. It's slower. You borrow money, which can reduce costs. And then, of course, you take in outside investment, which was something that we were not really doing much of in Miami prior to my mayoralty and prior to the Venture Miami movement. And now we've moved about $3 trillion in assets under managed companies. In other words, private equity that has come to Miami that can now scale Miami companies. And we've grown our venture capital pipeline by about 500% in the last 2 years, which means that you have 500% more resources to fund and scale early stage and Series A, Series B companies than you had before.
Now, is that those types of aspects of breaking down barriers for entrepreneurs, can those scale up to the national level? Because those are things that can be very effective at the city level. How do you think about that at national level?
I believe they can. That's why I'm running for president in part. And the first time that I came to Cedar Rapids, the mayor took me to the incubator accelerator from Cedar Rapids. And I think first you have to create an ecosystem that's inviting. I think what happens is there has been, unfortunately, this situation in our country where innovators and investors of capital have felt unwelcome in American cities. And I'll give you two famous examples. One of them from New York, where New York vies for the Amazon HQ2 prize. They win the prize, right? 50,000 high-paying jobs, and then they say, no thank you, right? The other one famously where in San Francisco, they said, a bad word, Elon Musk, and he replied, message received, and left to Austin, right? So, it's not so important that it's particularly Amazon or particularly Elon. What's important is what is the signaling effect that as a city you are giving to the world and to the country. And the signaling effect is if you're an entrepreneur, if you start with nothing, if you want to risk it all, if you want to sacrifice time away from your family, if you want to invest all your life savings into a venture and build it from zero to a $1 billion company or $1 trillion company, we don't want you. And I think that was a very problematic signal. And at the same time, on December 4th of 2020, I put out a counter signal, which was an answer to a tweet that said, what if we move Silicon Valley to Miami? And I responded very innocently, not knowing what was going to happen. How can I help? But that counter message was an invitation. It was a signal as well, which is if you want to risk capital, if you want to scale companies, if you want to grow companies, if you're pro-entrepreneurship, we want you in Miami. We believe that's part of the American story, part of the American dream. And for us, in our community, we were successful. But it's always good when you have an opportunity to scale, and that's something that we hadn't really seen at any significant level.
Just building on your "How can I help" tweet that really kind of was heard throughout the world and the entrepreneurial world, how would you scale? The being president would involve balancing very large corporate companies against interests from entrepreneurship. And a big thing we hear at Inc. magazine is that entrepreneurs feel that they're kind of left behind, that a lot of elected officials really focus on the Googles, the Microsofts, and they kind of get swept into that. So how would you navigate that balance to still protect these entrepreneurs and drivers of the economy with these big, powerful institutions who are always going to be pressing down on the executive office with pressure?
Well, I think you have to first look at the macro environment. When I look at Miami's success, sure, part of it was having a public official that was saying, we want you, when the others were saying, we don't want you. But the other macro factors, one of them was the SALT deduction going away. So I think one of the first things we have to do, and I would do as president, is we have to balance our budget. This idea that we're overspending at the level that we are, and then we have the Fed sort of trying to correct on the other side, is creating a perfect storm of bad for small businesses, right? So you're losing purchasing power on the one hand because of record inflation, and then if you want to go borrow money to capitalize your business, to grow, you're getting hit with incredibly high interest rates. So we have to bring that back into balance, and that starts with the federal government. I think the second part is, how do you create ecosystems? And I think that requires a president who is going to emphasize the next generation of technologies. And they're often created by small companies. sometimes they're subsumed by some of these larger companies like Google eventually, or they're scaled, or they become large themselves. But many of them are small companies to begin with. And if you look at the way the world is going, and you look at extrapolations of a percentage of our GDP, we're going to be in an increasingly digital economy. I mean, that's pretty much irreversible at this point. And in the short order, we're going to go, 15, 20, 25% of our entire economy is going to be digital. So you need a president that understands that can create policies that are going to encourage that. Obviously, it's scary that we have such a high production of our advanced microchips in Taiwan, which creates a supply chain vulnerability for the U.S. And it's also a national security issue for us as well.
And just to follow on that, when you talk about balancing the budget, quite a few candidates have talked about actually cutting agencies. What should we know as entrepreneurs about what would happen to the SBA, what would happen to certain divisions within commerce, like the patent office, things that would really affect small businesses?
Well, look, I think generally speaking, government is often bloated. And I can tell you, when I first got elected in 2009 to the council, we had basically what they call a do-nothing deficit. The delta between revenue and expenses was 20%. We had 20% more expenses projected than income. We had to cut it in 1 year. And we did it without reducing services, one iota. And so it's doable. It's painful, by the way. It's not fun. But it is doable. And we were able to get to a place where eventually we made it up. But at the moment, you had to make some tough choices, particularly on the salary side. The way we did it was salary and pensions at the time. And I think you have to take a deep look at the budget, and you have to factor in what are the best ways that you can save. And of course, spending is a major part of it as well. And then you have to look at ROI opportunities like SBA, and you look at commerce, and you have to make sure that what you're spending on is giving you a high ROI, right? So I'll give you an example on affordable housing. We just did our last tranche of affordable housing in the city. We invested $50 million, and we got $100 million worth of product for $50 million of investment. That's a 20-to-1 leverage rate. If you're getting 20-to-1 leverage on any program, it's a program you should keep, right? It's a huge ROI. And particularly when you're considering something so fundamental as affordable housing, where we created 3,500 units at all income levels with that $100 million. As interest rates go up, the leverage is going to go down. But we have another 57 million coming in right after that. So I think that's the issue is you gotta laser focus on some of these programs, look at the ROI. If the ROI is good, obviously they should be kept.
Following up on, you've been a big advocate of crypto, encouraging, nurturing these businesses. We've had a lot of these businesses appear in Inc. magazine, but you also have definitely a lot of vulnerabilities with the crypto market and concerns coming out of Washington. How would you balance that, this kind of cultivating businesses, cultivating new businesses that people are excited about, but also the risk to a lot of Americans?
I think it starts with clear regulation, right? There hasn't been a clear regulatory environment. I'm not sure if it's because many people who are in Washington don't understand the technology, but I think it's in large part responsible for some of the things that we've seen. Some of the abuses that we've seen in the last few years. Had Washington tackled the problem, provided clear rules and guidance for example, what you could do with custodial assets as one easy example, right? We've had banks here for hundreds of years. And by the way, there's been all kinds of regulations, periods of deregulation, and that's created some issues with banking as well. So it's not like banking is the perfect model. But certainly, what you did with custodial assets would have been an easy one for the federal government to regulate. And maybe some of these offshore companies would not have been offshore companies. Maybe they would have been onshore companies, because the technology that they had wasn't problematic. What was problematic was the decisions that they were making with the assets that they were custodying, right? Which were heavily, which were risky and in some cases fraudulent. So I think that was the big issue there. I think what's exciting about crypto is it's a generational technology, and it has the ability to create generational prosperity if developed properly. And like AI, we're seeing now this advent of AI.
Yeah.
But there was a long winter of AI from the 90s and the 80s when it seemed like AI had hit a wall in terms of its ability to actually be helpful to humanity. And it took them 20, 30 years to break through that and create a situation where now there's an inevitability to AI. I think crypto is going through the same thing. I think it's the strong companies, the strong engineers and builders will survive, and they're going to create financial products that everyday people can use in a way that is not hyper risky or lacks in transparency. I think having fractionalized ownership in debt and equity is one very, very interesting use case. So for example, all the buildings in this city are basically financed in the same way. There's an equity check, and then there's a bank that finances it. Unless you're a shareholder in the bank, or unless you have a ton of money and you're part of the equity, you have no benefit from the creation of that asset. There's only a certain segment of our society that can benefit from it. And those are high yield investments oftentimes. Now with the fractionalization of debt and equity, you're gonna be able to, mom and pop can put $100 into the debt of a building, which is safe and much better yielding than maybe a certificate of deposit or a treasury bond or treasury bill. And they get the best of both worlds. So they're acting like a more sophisticated investor in an asset that can be transparent and that can be de-risked in terms of fraud.
I've got some questions from viewers, either people in the audience or people that are online that have asked. And one of the questions is around immigrants. And Miami's a city of immigrants.
Yeah.
It's maybe the most immigrant city in the country. And immigrants, as you probably know, they start businesses at twice the rate of non-immigrants in the country, but their businesses don't tend to grow as fast, right? They have struggles in actually expanding faster. Question from the audience, what would you do to help immigrant entrepreneurs succeed?
Well, my parents came to this country at 12 and 7, fleeing communism in Cuba, where a leader there said, give us all your businesses and give us all your property, and don't worry, we'll make everybody equal. And he did. He made everybody equally poor and equally miserable. So that's certainly not the answer. And I think what you see in the immigrant communities is oftentimes they're very much small business, very entrepreneurial, as we talked about some of the metrics of Miami. But for whatever reason, there was a lack of scale. There was a lack of capital for scaling. So I think what's important is to look at different pockets of this country and find out how do you marry entrepreneurship with capital and with scale, and how do you bridge that gap? I think you can do it now easier than ever because we live in a much more decentralized world where people are not necessarily working and living in the same exact place. So I think there's just some great opportunities in the new sort of tech economy to do that. But I also think even if it's not a tech economy, even if it's just a regular business, I think capital is also more transferable than it's ever been. It's not necessarily all warehoused in one particular location, which is why I've been so excited to see the evolution of Miami and the growth of Miami as a potential tech hub, as a potential what I call capital of capital. And I think that that's something that we need to leverage nationally and globally.
Well, that is kind of an interesting aspect, is that blending of tech and non-tech, because Intuit did a study recently and found that 91% of all businesses now are tech-enabled.
There you go.
So, and their conclusion is there's really there's no such a company as a pure brick-and-mortar company anymore. But to that point around, like, how do you scale and grow a business? This becomes part of the challenge of entrepreneurship because you start touching upon all these complicated areas, from healthcare to education to childcare issues to capital access issues to red tape and regulatory issues. It becomes so much more complex as you grow a business. How does one even approach that challenge of all the different barriers that entrepreneurs face as they grow?
Look, I was yesterday in Des Moines in my hotel, and I ran into someone in the lobby who was talking about carbon capture of ethanol, right? So even technology that at some level seems like it's getting to a place where it's reaching its limit, something comes in, a new technology comes in, layers on top of it, and takes it from where it is to where it can be. So I just think there has to be a constant desire to innovate, and that has to be embedded in our DNA. And our leaders, and the mayor does a great job of this, have to continue to cultivate it and try to use our bully pulpit. That's one of the things that I think I've done successfully. In telling the story and bringing people who are capital aggregators to your community to try to continue to help push the envelope. I think you have to make places friendly for young people. We were rated #1 in the nation for Gen X workers. So I think that's important because they often represent the future of a community. So, look, it's a challenge, but it's one that I think is surmountable. And I do think that it's going back to a point that I made just a few minutes ago, the fact that we live in a decentralized world does benefit, cities across America. Why? The cost of living in cities is not equal, right? It's a lot more expensive to live in Miami than it is to live in a variety of other cities across the country. So if someone works in a company that was created in Miami and scaled in Miami, but they live in another city, they can live potentially a better quality of life for the dollar that they're earning. So I think that also presents some interesting challenges, because that person who's living in that city can then create innovations for other businesses that are in that ecosystem.
Another question from the audience is around how this all ties into national security and competitiveness. You touched on this issue before, and you talked about the issues with other countries where your parents came from, where the system didn't allow entrepreneurship, but also therefore had an effect on the national strength.
No doubt.
What do you think about the relationship between entrepreneurship and national security in this context?
I think the relationship between our economy, which is driven in large part by entrepreneurship, and national security goes hand in hand. I think if you look at what China has done, it has been mostly a projection of economic strength through the Belt and Roads system, where they've lent money to countries around the world, and they've used that as a way of increasing and projecting their strength globally. And that's something that we have to confront. Not to mention the fact that I think they have 85% coverage of 5G. I think we're like at 15-20%, the latest numbers that I looked at. They have significant capabilities in terms of PhDs in computer engineering, and also in terms of quantum computing and supercomputing. So those are things that we have to compete on a global basis. We're seeing now some of the investments that we're making in, like I said, trying to bring advanced microchips back into this country, because we know that the issue of Taiwan is a precarious issue, one where if China were to move against Taiwan's independence, and we were not able to get some of the goods and services that are produced out of Taiwan, I was told by a high-level chip manufacturing executive that it would be a 14% reduction of our GDP. Now that is Great Depression-like reduction. But aside from that, just the numbers aspect of it, I mean, our phones, everything that we use is produced with some of these chips. And so it literally would be such a disruption to our quality of life and our way of life that I think one of the things that is, if there was any benefit from COVID, it demonstrated the vulnerability in our supply chain. And so I think it's now starting to make us rethink where we produce things, what are the real costs, right, in terms of vulnerability of producing things. And it actually is an opportunity also to nearshore, homeshore, and friendshore some of our productive supply chain as a means of creating more prosperity in our hemisphere, and doing sort of stealing something from China's playbook, right? It's using our economic might to project our strength as a national security issue.
I just want to pivot back to the great question from the audience about immigrant businesses.
Yeah.
I met with a fantastic immigrant business owner in the fall, and she's in the tech space. And when I was telling her about this forum, we stayed in touch. She said, as a tech company, she's really getting folded into the crackdown on big tech. So she came to this country, she's creating jobs, she is an immigrant business owner, but she now feels like she's being treated like a Google, a Microsoft, and she doesn't inhabit that world. So what would you do to protect these entrepreneurs who are trying to innovate in these spaces and are often to have companies bought out by the bigger to keep their businesses going?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the crackdown of big tech has become very political, right? And I've tried to depoliticize sort of my role as an ecosystem builder, right? And I really feel that for this country to be successful, we have to focus on opportunities and lean into them from a generational perspective. I think for that one business owner, I would say that I would lead in a way that doesn't demonize her business, right? Doesn't demonize what she's doing, and actually does the exact opposite, extols the virtue of technology. I think, it's interesting because originally there was a thought when I answered the question in the way that I did of how can I help, and people started coming to Miami. There was a concern that it was going to change our politics. And it actually did change our politics, but it changed our politics in the opposite direction that a lot of people thought it would. People thought, oh, people are going to be coming from these blue cities and these blue states, and they're going to come to Miami and they're going to make Florida blue. And it was exactly the opposite. Miami actually was plus 30 for the Democrats in 2016. In 2022, in the midterms, it went plus 10 for Republicans. That's a 40-point swing in favor of Republicans. So I think that there is a misperception sometimes that we should hyper-politicize these things. And I think on the contrary, I think you need a leader who understands the technology, who wants to advocate for entrepreneurs, who wants to advocate for people in tech, because by and large, tech has been, first of all, tech is something we're here is here to stay, right? And secondly, it does oftentimes, and most of the time, produce benefits. Now, are there abuses? Of course. Are there times where it goes too far? Absolutely. Do we have to be wary of certain kinds of tech and the acceleration of it? Sure, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. But I do think it also requires someone who understands the tech. And oftentimes we have leaders that don't understand the tech, don't want to confront it, and don't want to take the time and the energy to learn about it.
How would you reframe the kind of perception of entrepreneurship and business? Of all the candidates we're speaking to, I have to say, you're the candidate my kids know, because Lionel Messi has gone to Miami. You've brought race cars to Miami, and that generates jobs, business. How would you reframe that on a national scale, the perception of business?
So I think for me, the way I look at it is, whenever you're trying to create an ecosystem, whether it's a country or whether it's a city, it's really the same thing. You want to create a premium quality of life. What we all have, there's two things we have in common when we all leave from here. Number one is we want to live in a place where you have the best quality of life. And the second thing that we have in common is that we all have a finite amount of time on this earth, right? None of us here are going to live forever. Unless AI somehow changes that. But most of us are going to be here for a finite amount of time. And so we're also looking at our return on time, right? People focus on how much money they have in their bank account, how much Bitcoin or whatever. But the truth is, we should be focusing more on how do we get the most out of the time that we have here. And I think we've built our city based on that principle. You just articulated some, having the most unique and special sports offerings, having some of the unique and special cultural offerings, making sure that we have public spaces that are enjoyable, where people can feel comfortable, having a safe city. This year we are 38% below in homicides from a 1964 low of last year. Okay, when you compare us to, and I'm not trying to pick on a city, but Chicago, who has had, led the country in homicides 11 years in a row. Okay, they had 700 homicides. Last year, or this year, year to date, we're at 16. Okay, that impacts, not only saves lives, because that's people that are not dying, but it also creates a psychological scenario under which people want to come live in your city. We're also ranked the happiest city in America and the healthiest city in America. So I think those qualitative factors are very important. And we want to live in the healthiest city in the healthiest country in the world. We want to live in the happiest country in the world. We want to live in a place where the per capita wealth is growing, where we're reducing poverty. We reduced poverty in our city by 50% in the last 20 years. And we want to live in a safe country because safety is a higher order need for all of us, so that we can focus on having the best quality of life and focus on having the best return on our time.
Last question for me. What should entrepreneurs expect? What are 2 to 3 things you would do for entrepreneurs if you're elected president?
The first thing I would do is balance our budget so that we can get, our inflation and interest rate under control. That's going to be the biggest benefit that you can give any entrepreneur, which is to say, we don't have to worry about the federal government making our life more difficult. Right? The second thing is, as a Republican Hispanic president, I think I'm in a unique position to solve the immigration crisis forever. It's a multi-decade, multi-administration crisis. And I think we have to peg it to objective criteria like unemployment, like the need for skilled and unskilled labor in particular markets, and to the declining birth rate. I mean, we're similar to China in that China and the US have both declining birth rates. The difference is everybody wants to come here, nobody wants to necessarily go there. So I think that's a benefit that should be a generational benefit for the country, immigration, and for our ability to staff and grow our companies. And I think the third thing is I'm going to be a president that focuses on innovation and the economy of the future and helps create the conditions for us to thrive in that. I've done that in the city of Miami, and I want to do that nationally. I think what you as a voter have to think about is who are you going to invest your confidence in? Are you going to invest it in someone that has had success in doing this at the private and public sector level, or are you going to invest it in someone that hasn't? And I think that's what voters have to decide.
Mayor Suarez, thank you so much
Right on the nose.
We nailed it perfectly. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Yeah, great to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
A 7-minute break, and we'll be right back. Thank you all.